My mother-in-law announced my miscarriage to 30 guests at dinner to get sympathy, so I announced her 7-year affair with a church deacon at her anniversary party. I've spent the last 6 years of my life being the person who catches everyone else when they fall. I'm a nurse by trade, so caretaking is in my DNA, but I didn't realize that when I married Mark, I wasn't just joining a family, I was signing up to be the primary benefactor for a woman who viewed me as nothing more than a walking, talking ATM with a high tolerance for emotional abuse. Eleanor, my mother-in-law, is the kind of woman who commands a room with a Bible in one hand and a metaphorical dagger in the other. She is the grand matriarch of the First Baptist Church of Grace, a woman whose pearls are as white as her supposed soul and whose judgment is as sharp as her ironed linens. To the world, she's a grieving widow who lost her husband too young and dedicated her life to charity. To me, she was a parasite. When Mark and I first got married, Eleanor claimed her late husband had left her with mountainous debts and a mortgage she couldn't manage on a teacher's pension. I felt for her, I really did. My own mother passed away when I was young, and I wanted so badly to have a maternal figure in my life. I convinced Mark, who was always a peace at any cost kind of man, that we should help her. For 5 years, we paid $1,800 every single month toward her mortgage and her medical expenses. She claimed she had a rare heart condition that required expensive, non-covered holistic treatments and specialized supplements. I worked double shifts at the hospital, picking up every holiday and weekend I could, just to make sure Eleanor didn't lose her home. I wore shoes with holes in the soles. I didn't buy new clothes for 3 years. Meanwhile, Eleanor was always dressed in the finest Sunday suits, her hair perfectly coiffed, her skin glowing from the expensive treatments I was funding. She would look at my tired eyes and my scrub-clad reflection and sigh, saying, "Clara, dear, you really should take better care of yourself. You look so haggard." It's a poor reflection on Mark. "I'm just tired, Eleanor," I'd say, trying to keep my voice steady. "The overtime is a lot." "Well," she'd reply, sipping the premium organic tea I'd bought her, "we all have our crosses to bear. Mine is my health, yours is apparently your vanity." The financial drain was astronomical. Between the mortgage, the medical bills, and the occasional emergency, like when she needed $4,000 for a mission trip to a resort in Sedona that she claimed was for spiritual healing, we had given her upwards of $130,000 over half a decade. We had no savings. We lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment with a radiator that hissed like a cornered cat. But whenever I brought up the idea of her downsizing, she would launch into a dramatic episode. She'd clutch her chest, gasp for air, and remind us that this house was the only thing she had left of Mark's father. "You want to strip me of my memories?" she'd wail. "After all I've sacrificed to raise a son who would marry a woman so calculating." Mark would always crumble. He'd hold her hand, glare at me with eyes full of guilt, and apologize. I was the villain for wanting a future. I was the villain for wanting a house of our own. The dynamic in the family was always skewed. Mark was the scapegoat, the one responsible for his mother's happiness and financial stability. His sister, Sarah, was the golden child. Sarah lived a life of leisure, finding herself through various failed art projects and expensive retreats, all while Eleanor funneled the money we gave her directly into Sarah's bank account. I didn't know that yet, of course. I thought Eleanor was struggling. I thought she was sick. 2 years ago, Mark and I decided we couldn't wait any longer to start a family. I was 34, and the stress was taking its toll. We started IVF, which was another $20,000 we didn't have. I took out a personal loan without telling Eleanor, knowing she would find a way to claim that money was hers by right. The process was grueling. The hormones made me sick, the injections left my stomach bruised and purple, and the emotional roller coaster was exhausting. Eleanor's reaction to our IVF journey was predictably cruel. She didn't offer a cent, but she offered plenty of divine wisdom. "If God wanted you to be a mother, Clara, he wouldn't have made your womb so inhospitable," she said over a Sunday roast that I had paid for and cooked. "Perhaps you're being punished for your lack of faith, or perhaps you're just too focused on the material world." I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. I didn't tell her that the material world she was criticizing was currently paying for the very chair she was sitting in. I didn't tell her that if I had faith, it was in the science that was trying to give me the one thing I wanted more than anything. After 3 failed rounds, it finally happened. 2 pink lines. I cried for 3 hours. Mark held me, and for the first time in years, we felt like we were winning. We decided to keep it a secret until the 12-week mark. We knew how high the risks were, and we wanted this piece of joy to be ours alone before the world and Eleanor could get their hands on it. But at 8 weeks, I started cramping. It happened on a Tuesday. I was at work in the middle of a shift when the pain became unbearable. I knew immediately. By the time Mark got me to the ER, it was over. The silence of the ultrasound room was the loudest thing I've ever heard. No heartbeat, just a flickering gray screen and a doctor with a look of practiced sympathy. I was devastated. I fell into a dark, hollow pit of grief. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, and I couldn't look at the small box of baby clothes I'd hidden in the back of the closet. Mark was heartbroken too, but he was also terrified of his mother. He had accidentally let it slip that we were expecting a blessing during one of her many chest pain episodes a week prior, trying to cheer her up. When the miscarriage happened, I begged him, do not tell your mother. I cannot handle her theology right now. I cannot handle her making this about herself. Please, Mark, give me this time to just be, he promised. He swore on everything he held dear that he wouldn't say a word. 3 days later, Eleanor insisted on hosting a celebration of life dinner at her house. It was ostensibly for a member of her church who had recovered from a flu, but in reality, it was just an excuse for her to play the grand hostess. There were 30 people there, church elders, the deacon, the flying monkeys of her social circle, and her golden child, Sarah. I didn't want to go. I was still bleeding, physically and emotionally. I was wearing a heavy pad and a dark dress, feeling like my body was a tomb. But Mark pleaded with me. She'll make it a huge scene if we don't show up, Clara. She's already suspicious because we haven't answered her calls. Just 2 hours. We'll eat, we'll leave. I went. I sat at that long mahogany table, surrounded by the smell of expensive lilies and the sound of performative laughter. Eleanor was at the head of the table, presiding over the room like a queen. She looked radiant. She was wearing a new silk blouse that I knew cost $400 because I'd seen the charge on the emergency credit card we gave her for medications. Halfway through the main course, Eleanor stood up. She tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon, demanding silence. The room fell quiet. She looked around, her eyes landing on me with a look of faux tenderness that made my skin crawl. Friends, family, she began, her voice quivering with a practiced tremor. As you know, my life has been one of many trials, but I have always found strength in sharing our burdens. Tonight, I have a heavy heart, and I ask for your prayers for my son and his wife. My fork hit the plate with a clatter. Mark went pale beside me. I looked at him, my eyes wide with a silent no. Eleanor didn't miss a beat. She wiped a non-existent tear from her eye. It is with a broken heart that I must tell you all. Clara has lost the baby. Our little angel has returned to heaven before we could even hold them. I know many of you were looking forward to a new addition to our church family, but alas, the Lord had other plans. It has been a devastating week for me, trying to be the pillar of strength for these two. The room erupted into a cacophony of gasps and, oh, how terrible, and poor Eleanor, she's so brave. I felt the blood drain from my face. The world started to tilt. 30 sets of eyes were on me, some pitying, some judging, some just hungry for the gossip. I looked at Eleanor, and for a split second, the mask slipped. She wasn't sad. She was thriving. She was basking in the attention. She had taken my most private, agonizing trauma and turned it into a centerpiece for her dinner party. She had used my dead child to get sympathy points from her congregation. Eleanor, I whispered, my voice shaking. How could you? She looked at me, her expression shifting instantly to one of livid innocence. Oh, Clara, darling, we don't hide our sorrows in this house. We share them so the community can lift us up. You're being so emotional. It's the hormones, I understand, but you shouldn't be selfish with your grief. Selfish? I stood up, the chair screeching against the hardwood. I asked for privacy. I begged for it. And I knew better, she said, her voice turning cold and authoritative. You're young. You don't understand how these things work. Now sit down. You're making a scene and ruining the evening for our guests. Let us pray. She actually bowed her head. She expected me to sit there and be prayed over by the people she had just used to humiliate me. Mark reached for my hand, whispering, Clara, please, just sit down. We'll talk about this later. I pulled my hand away. I didn't say another word. I walked out of that house, the sound of Eleanor's prayer echoing behind me. I walked 3 miles in the dark because Mark had the car keys, and I couldn't stand to be in the same space as him for even a second. That night, I didn't cry. The grief was still there, but it had been cauterized by a white-hot, blinding rage. I realized then that Eleanor didn't love Mark, and she certainly didn't love me. We were resources, we were props, and she had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She thought she was untouchable because of her piety. She thought she was the ultimate moral authority. She thought her secrets were safe because she spent her Sundays in the front pew and her weekdays manipulating everyone around her. She was wrong. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of hyper-focused clarity. I didn't go to work. I didn't talk to Mark, who was sleeping on the couch and sending me endless texts about how his mother meant well and just has a different way of processing things. I knew Eleanor's heart condition was a lie. I knew her financial ruin was a lie. But I needed more. I needed the kind of proof that would strip her of the only thing she actually valued, her reputation. It started with a simple realization. Eleanor was technologically illiterate, or so she claimed. She always had me fix her phone or update her iPad. But she had recently gotten a new iPhone, paid for by me, and I realized I still had the login credentials for her iCloud from when I set it up for her. She thought I was the dumb nurse who just followed orders. She never imagined that I would be the one to go digging through the digital basement of her life. What I found in those first few hours was just the tip of the iceberg. There were no medical specialists in her contacts. There were, however, dozens of transfers from her bank account to Sarah's. She hadn't been paying off a mortgage. She had been funneling our money into a high-interest savings account in her own name, while Sarah used the rest for travel expenses. But that wasn't the big one. The big one was a folder labeled Church Business. Inside were hundreds of photos, videos, and saved text chats. They didn't involve church business. They involved Deacon Miller, the most respected, married, God-fearing man in the congregation, the man who sat next to his wife of 40 years every Sunday, the man who had presided over the prayer for my miscarriage. The affair hadn't just been a fling. It had been going on for 7 years. There were photos of them in hotels I had paid for. There were videos of Eleanor laughing about how easy it was to get money out of Mark and that little nurse. One video, dated only 3 weeks ago, showed Eleanor and the deacon sitting in a car. She was complaining about how Mark and I were wasting money on IVF. I told her it's her own fault for being so high-strung, Eleanor said in the video, her voice dripping with malice. If she actually gets pregnant, the money will dry up. I need to make sure she knows that a baby won't change her status in this family. She's just the help with a ring on her finger. The deacon laughed and kissed her hand. You're a marvel, Eleanor, so devoted to the Lord's work. I sat in the dark of my living room, the blue light of the laptop screen reflecting in my eyes. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. She had called me the help. She had mocked my infertility. She had used the money I earned by cleaning up vomit and blood in the ICU to fund her trysts with a married man. The 30th anniversary of Eleanor's dedication to the church and her wedding anniversary to her late husband, which she still celebrated as a widow's tribute, was in 2 weeks. It was going to be the biggest event of the year for her. Over 100 guests, a banquet hall, a slideshow of her life of service. I had 2 weeks to build a paper trail that would burn her world to the ground. For the next 48 hours, Eleanor didn't apologize. She didn't call to see if I was physically okay after walking 3 miles in the dark while recovering from a medical procedure. Instead, she went on the offensive. It started with a text message sent to a group chat that included Mark, Sarah, and 4 of her prayer warrior friends from church. Prayers for my daughter-in-law, Clara, the message read. She is struggling with a spirit of anger and resentment following her loss. She lashed out at me tonight in front of our guests, and while my heart is wounded, I forgive her. She is not herself. Please ask the Lord to soften her heart so she can accept the support this community wants to give her. The support arrived within hours in the form of flying monkeys. My phone didn't stop buzzing. People I hadn't spoken to in years, distant cousins of Mark's, ladies from the church choir, were sending me encouraging verses about the dangers of pride and the beauty of submission to family elders. Sarah even had the audacity to call me and leave a voicemail. Hey Clara, Mom is really upset. She's been crying all morning about how you humiliated her at her own dinner table. I know you're going through a lot, but you really need to think about how your behavior affects her health. Her heart condition is acting up because of the stress you're causing. Just call her and apologize, okay? Let's move past this. Her heart condition. That was the phrase that finally snapped the last thread of my patience. As a nurse, I've seen real heart failure. I've seen what restrictive cardiomyopathy, the specific diagnosis Eleanor claimed to have, does to a person. It causes edema, shortness of breath, a distinct pallor, and a specific type of lethargy. Eleanor, however, seemed to have the only case of cardiomyopathy in medical history that allowed her to spend 4 hours gardening in the direct sun and another 3 hours standing at a pulpit. I sat down at our kitchen table with a legal pad. I needed to see the numbers. I needed to see the physical cost of her lies. I pulled up my bank statements from the last 5 years. Monthly mortgage payment for Eleanor, $1,800. Monthly medical supplement allowance, $600. Quarterly specialist visits, $1,200. Emergency repairs and church missions, average of $5,000 per year. The total was staggering, $153,000. That was the amount of money Mark and I had funneled into Eleanor's life. It was the house we didn't own. It was the retirement fund we hadn't started. It was the reason we had to take out a loan for the IVF that had just ended in a puddle of blood on a Tuesday afternoon. I felt a cold, clinical detachment take over. I wasn't just grieving a child anymore. I was investigating a crime. I started with the specialist visits. Eleanor always insisted on paying them in cash or through her own account, claiming the doctor's office didn't deal with insurance because of their pioneering holistic approach. She would bring us printed invoices on letterhead from a place called the Mercy Springs Wellness Center. I searched for Mercy Springs Wellness Center. It didn't exist. There was no medical license registered under that name in the state. I checked the address listed on the invoices. It was a P.O. box at a UPS store 3 towns over. Then I looked at the mortgage statement she had shown Mark years ago. I remembered seeing one on her kitchen counter, a document from Midwest Heritage Bank. I called the bank's general line. "I'm calling to verify the payoff status of a property for an estate planning matter," I said, using my most professional "I work at a hospital" voice. I gave them Eleanor's address. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the representative said. "That property doesn't have a mortgage with us. It was paid in full in 2012. 2 years before Mark and I even met. My father-in-law's life insurance had cleared the house. Eleanor didn't have a mortgage. She hadn't had one in over a decade. Every single penny of that $1,800 a month, over $100,000 in total, had gone straight into her pocket." I felt a surge of nausea. She hadn't just been helped, she had been embezzling from her own son's future while he worked 60-hour weeks as a high school teacher and I worked double shifts in the ICU. But the absurdity reached its peak on Thursday. I was at the grocery store trying to find something easy to eat when I saw a post on the First Baptist Church of Gray's Facebook page. It was a photo of Eleanor. She was sitting in her armchair, a crochet blanket over her knees, looking pale and fragile. The caption read, "A beloved sister Eleanor is facing a double tragedy. Not only has she lost her first grandchild, but the medical costs for her ongoing heart battle have become overwhelming during this time of family mourning. We are raising $10,000 for the Eleanor's Heart and Healing Fund. Give what you can to help this woman who has given so much to us." There was a link to a GoFundMe. It had already raised $4,200. People were leaving comments like, "Clara and Mark are so lucky to have a mother who carries their burdens," and "Eleanor is a saint among us." She was using my miscarriage as a marketing tool to crowd out a heart condition that didn't exist, to pay for a house that was already paid off. I didn't call Mark. I knew what he would do. He would try to mediate. He would tell me she's confused or that the money is going to a good cause anyway. He was still under the spell of 28 years of psychological conditioning. He couldn't see the monster because he had been trained to see a martyr. I needed professional help. I used the last $2,000 I had in my personal savings, money I had set aside for the baby's nursery, and I hired a private investigator named Elias. He was a retired cop with a face like a crumpled paper bag and a reputation for being ruthless. "I want everything," I told him in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of town. "I want her bank records. I want to know where the money goes. I want to know who she's talking to, and I want to know about Deacon Arthur Miller." Elias raised an eyebrow. "The church guy? He's a big deal around here. Wealthy, connected." "He's her spiritual advisor," I said, the word spiritual feeling like ash in my mouth. "I have reason to believe their relationship is a bit more secular." "Give me a week," Elias said. While Elias did the heavy lifting, the escalation from Eleanor's side didn't stop. She decided that my silence was a sign that I was being influenced by dark spirits. On Friday afternoon, while I was at the hospital, I got a notification from my Ring doorbell. It was Eleanor. She wasn't alone. She had Sarah with her and 2 other women from the church. They were carrying sage, Bibles, and what looked like a bottle of anointing oil. I watched through the camera as Eleanor pulled out her spare key, the one she was only supposed to use for emergencies. "She's not here," I heard Sarah say. "All the better," Eleanor replied. Her voice wasn't the frail, trembling whisper she used in public. It was sharp, cold, and efficient. "We need to clear this place out. All that medical equipment, the hormones, the science she was using to try and play God. That's why the baby died. It was an affront. We need to find those IVF medications and get them out of this house before they poison Mark's spirit any further." I watched in horror as they entered my home. I was 3 miles away, stuck in a sterile break room, watching my mother-in-law stage a spiritual raid on my apartment. I saw them through the indoor cameras I'd installed when we were worried about a string of local break-ins. They went straight for the kitchen. Eleanor found the refrigerated medications, thousands of dollars worth of hormones that I still needed to return or dispose of properly. She dumped them into a trash bag. Then they went to the bedroom. They went into the closet. Eleanor pulled out the small box I had hidden, the one with the tiny yellow onesie and the ultrasound photo from the 6-week scan. "This is the source of the idolatry," Eleanor said, holding the ultrasound photo. She worshipped the image instead of the creator. This is why she was humbled. She didn't just put it in the bag. She tore the ultrasound photo in half. I felt a scream built in my chest that I couldn't let out. I was at work. I had patience. I had to stay professional, but my hands were shaking so hard I had to put my phone down. "Should we tell Mark?" asked Sarah. "Mark doesn't need to know the details," Eleanor said, tossing the torn photo into the trash bag. "We'll just tell him tidied up to help them move on. He'll be grateful. He always is." They left 20 minutes later, having purged my home of my belongings and my grief. When I got home that night, the apartment felt violated. The air smelled of cheap incense and the anointing oil they had rubbed on the door frames. I walked to the trash can in the kitchen. It was empty. They had taken the bag with them. Mark was already home, sitting on the sofa. He looked relieved. "Hey, honey," he said. "Mom and Sarah stopped by today. They saw how overwhelmed we were and did some cleaning. Wasn't that sweet? Mom said she wanted to take the heavy reminders away so we could have a fresh start." I looked at him, truly looked at him. He was a good man, but he was a coward. He was a man who had been so thoroughly broken by his mother's love that he couldn't recognize a home invasion when it was framed as a favor. "They stole my medication, Mark," I said, my voice dangerously low, "and they tore up the only photo I had of our child." Mark flinched. "I'm sure she didn't mean to tear it, Clara. It was probably an accident. She thinks she's helping. She's worried about your soul." "My soul?" I laughed. It was a jagged, ugly sound. "She's worried about her bank account. She's worried that if I'm not distracted by a baby, I'll start asking where our $1,800 a month is actually going." "Don't start with the money again," Mark sighed, rubbing his face. "She's a sick, elderly widow. Can we just have one night of peace?" "Peace is over, Mark. You need to choose. Right now. You can either call the police and report the theft of those medications, or you can go stay at your mother's house. Because I am done." Mark looked at me like I was a stranger. "You'd really call the cops on my mother over some medicine?" "That medicine cost 4 months of my salary. That medicine was our chance." And she threw it away like trash. Mark didn't call the police. He did exactly what I expected him to do. He packed a bag, told me I was unstable and lacking grace, and he went to the one place where he always felt safe, the house I was paying for. The moment the door closed behind him, the silence of the apartment felt like a weapon. I sat on the floor of the empty nursery and waited for my phone to ring. It was Elias. "You're not going to believe this," he said. I followed the money. "Your mother-in-law isn't just a liar. She's a professional. That mortgage money? She's been using it to fund a series of real estate investments in Sarah's name. Your sister-in-law owns a condo in the city that you've essentially paid for." "And the deacon?" I asked. "That's where it gets interesting. Arthur Miller isn't just her boyfriend. He's her partner in the fundraising. They've been skimming from the church's building fund for years."
"But that's not the best part." Elias paused, and I could hear the rustle of paper. I bugged the car. They had a little meeting this evening after the church fundraiser kicked off. I've got a recording of Eleanor laughing about how she performed the miscarriage announcement to get the congregation to open their wallets. She called it her best work yet. And then, Clara, she told the deacon that she's planning to convince Mark to divorce you so she can move into a bigger house with the divorce settlement she thinks he'll get from your joint assets. She wants him to divorce me? She said you're getting too smart for your own good and that you're starting to sniff around. She told the deacon, and I quote, "I'll have him out of that marriage by the anniversary party. He's always been a mama's boy. He'll do what I tell him once I convince him she's crazy." I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. The betrayal was so complete, so total, that there was no longer any room for doubt or hesitation. "Elias," I said, "how quickly can you get me the full bank records for the deacon and Eleanor? And I need every photo you've taken of them together, every hotel receipt, every mission trip itinerary that matches their weekend getaways." "I have most of it already. Why? What are you planning?" "The 30th anniversary party is in 10 days, I said. Eleanor has been planning it for months. She's calling it a lifetime of faithfulness. She's invited the whole town. She wants a celebration of her life's work. And I think it's time she got exactly what she deserved. I'm going to give her a celebration she'll never forget." The next week was a blur of tactical planning. I didn't reach out to Mark. I let him stay in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by the ghosts of his mother's manipulation. I let him listen to her lies about how I was spiraling and how I was unfit to be a mother. I knew that every word she spoke was just another nail in the coffin I was building for her reputation. I spent my nights at the hospital, working my shifts with a mask of perfect composure. But in my bag, I had a flash drive. On that drive was a meticulously curated PowerPoint presentation. It didn't start with the affair. No, that would be too quick. It started with the sacrifice. I scanned every single bank statement. I highlighted every mortgage payment we had made to a bank that didn't hold a mortgage. I included the letter from the bank confirming the house had been paid off in 2012. I included the medical bills from the fake wellness center, juxtaposed with the veterinarian's license of the man who actually owned the P.O. box. I included the GoFundMe screenshots, followed by the video footage from my Ring camera showing Eleanor and Sarah entering my home and stealing my medications. I had the high-definition audio of Eleanor saying, "I worshipped the image instead of the creator."
This is why she was humbled as she tore my baby's ultrasound. And then the finale, the faithfulness section. Elias had outdone himself. He had captured photos of Eleanor and Deacon Miller at a spiritual retreat in a coastal town 4 hours away. The photos showed them on a balcony, sharing a bottle of wine, their hands in places that definitely weren't brotherly. He had the hotel receipt charged to the emergency credit card I had given Eleanor for her heart medication. He had a recording of them in the deacon's Lexus discussing how much they could squeeze out of the church's new roof fund. People are so gullible, Arthur. Eleanor's voice was crystal clear on the recording. They see a widow in a Sunday hat and they just want to give. It's almost too easy. And Mark, bless his heart, he's so desperate for my approval he'd let me rob him blind. And he did. $1,800 a month for 5 years. I haven't paid a bill since 2015. I watched the presentation over and over. I made sure the transitions were smooth. I made sure the audio was balanced. On Wednesday, 4 days before the party, Eleanor sent me one final text. Clara, I've decided to be the bigger person. Despite your behavior, I have reserved a seat for you at my anniversary celebration this Sunday. I want the family to be whole. Mark tells me you've been busy. I hope you've spent that time in prayer. I expect you to be there in a modest dress, and I expect an apology before the guests arrive. Don't be late. This is a big day for the church and for me. I replied with 2 words. I'll be there. She thought she was inviting me to her coronation. She didn't realize she had just handed me the keys to her execution. I spent the rest of the week gathering the flying monkeys. I didn't try to defend myself to them. Instead, I sent out a mass email to the entire anniversary committee. Subject, special surprise for Eleanor's 30th, I wrote. As Eleanor's daughter-in-law, I want to contribute something special to the ceremony. I've put together a comprehensive life and legacy tribute video. It's quite long, about 20 minutes, and covers her entire journey of faithfulness and sacrifice. I would love to project it during the main toast. Please let me know if I can handle the tech setup so it remains a surprise for her. The response was instantaneous. Oh, Clara, that is so beautiful of you. We knew you had a good heart. We will make sure the projector is ready. Eleanor will be so moved. Moved wasn't the word for it. On Saturday night, the day before the party, Mark finally came home. He looked tired and gray. He sat at the kitchen table, avoiding my eyes. Mom says you're coming to the party. I am. She said you're going to apologize. I have a lot to say, Mark. I think everyone will be very surprised by my contribution. Mark looked at me then, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. What does that mean? Clara, please.
Just for one day, can we not have any drama? This is her big moment. She's worked so hard for that church. She has, Mark. She's worked harder than you could possibly imagine. And tomorrow, I'm going to make sure everyone sees exactly what that hard work has produced. I don't like the way you're sounding, he said, standing up. Maybe it's better if you don't go. I'll tell her you're sick. No, Mark, I wouldn't miss this for the world. In fact, I've already sent the video to the committee. They've already seen the title slide. They're very excited. Video? What video? A tribute to your mother, I said, smiling for the first time in weeks. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who had already won. It's called A Lifetime of Faithfulness. It's very thorough. He looked at me for a long moment, then shook his head. Whatever. Just wear something nice. Don't embarrass me. Oh, Mark, I whispered as he walked toward the bedroom. I'm not the one who's going to be embarrassed. The banquet hall of the First Baptist Church of Grace was draped in what I called Eleanor blue, a specific, cloying shade of hydrangea that matched her favorite Sunday suit. There were over 100 people there. The air smelled of expensive catering, floor wax, and the suffocating scent of lilies. It felt less like a church anniversary and more like a coronation. At the front of the room, a large projector screen had been set up. Beside it sat a technical booth where a young, eager volunteer named Toby was managing the audiovisual equipment. I had spent the previous afternoon training him on how to play my file. I told him it was a multi-layered sensory experience and that he wasn't to stop it under any circumstances, even if there was technical feedback, because it was timed perfectly to Eleanor's emotional journey. Eleanor was in her element. She moved through the crowd like a holy celebrity, her hand perpetually pressed to her chest in that practiced gesture of fragile grace. She was wearing a new pearls and silk ensemble, another medical emergency expense, I'm sure. Mark walked behind her like a loyal footman, holding her shawl and looking miserable. When she saw me, her eyes narrowed for a split second before she plastered on a mask of saintly forgiveness. She glided over, Sarah trailing behind her like a mini-me. Clara, Eleanor said, her voice loud enough for the nearby elders to hear, I am so glad you chose to join us. I know your heart has been troubled. To see you here, dressed so appropriately, tells me you're ready to seek atonement. I'm ready for the truth to come out, Eleanor, I said, my voice steady. Good, good, she said, patting my cheek with a cold, dry hand. We'll have our little talk later, but for now, sit. Enjoy the fruits of a life well lived. Mark pulled me aside as she moved on to greet Deacon Miller and his wife Martha. Martha was a quiet, bird-like woman who had spent 40 years being the perfect deacon's wife, never suspecting that her husband's late-night counseling sessions were taking place in boutique hotels. "Clara, please," Mark whispered. "Just stay quiet. Don't look at her like that. People are starting to whisper." "Let them whisper, Mark. They'll have plenty to talk about soon." The dinner was a grueling 3-course affair of bland chicken and performative piety. Eleanor stood up several times to offer small reflections on her 30 years of service. She talked about the sacrifices she had made as a widow. She mentioned with a heavy sigh how she had shouldered the financial burdens of her family so her son could thrive. I saw Mark lower his head, the guilt I had watched her instill in him for a decade visibly weighing him down. Finally, it was time for the main event. Deacon Miller stood up to give the keynote toast.
He was a tall man with silver hair and a booming, authoritative voice, the kind of voice that made people feel like they were hearing from God himself. "Eleanor," he began, raising a glass of sparkling cider, "you are the definition of faithfulness. In a world that forgets its promises, you have stood firm. You have been a pillar to this church, a mother to the fatherless, and a woman of impeccable moral character. Your late husband would be so proud to see how you have honored his name." He looked at her with a warmth that was disgusting once you knew what was behind it. Eleanor wiped a tear from her eye, looking like a martyr in a Renaissance painting. "And now," the deacon continued, "Clara, Eleanor's daughter-in-law, has prepared a special tribute, a look back at 30 years of a life lived in the light. Toby, if you would." The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the room. I stood up and walked to the side of the stage, my heart hammering against my ribs, but not from fear. It was the adrenaline of an apex predator. The first slide appeared on the screen. It was a beautiful, high-resolution photo of Eleanor in front of the church 10 years ago. The text over it read, "Eleanor, a legacy of truth and sacrifice." The crowd cooed. Eleanor smiled, her face illuminated by the glow of her own image. Then the second slide hit. It wasn't a photo of Eleanor. It was a scanned copy of the 2012 property deed for her house with the "paid in full" stamp circled in bright neon red. Beside it was a chart I had made, titled "Mortgage Payments Received from Mark and Clara, 2018-2023. The total was displayed in massive bold numbers, $108,000. The room went silent. Not a respectful hush, but the kind of silence that happens right before a car crash. I saw Mark sit up straight, his brow furrowed as he stared at the screen. He knew that document. He had seen the fake versions she'd shown him for years. "What is this?" someone whispered in the back. I didn't give them time to process. The next slide appeared. It was a side-by-side comparison. On the left, an invoice from Mercy Springs Wellness Center for $1,200 for Eleanor's heart medication. On the right, a screenshot of the business registry showing that Mercy Springs was registered to a P.O. box owned by a local dog groomer who happened to be Sarah's best friend. "Oh my God," Sarah gasped, her face turning a ghostly shade of white. Eleanor stood up, her chair screeching against the floor. "Toby, stop this! This is a mistake! Clara, what have you done?" "I'm just showing them your legacy, Eleanor," I said, my voice amplified by the microphone on the podium. "Don't you want them to see how much we've sacrificed for you?" The video portion began. The audio from the Ring camera filled the hall. It was the sound of Eleanor's voice, clear and cold, echoing through the speakers. "That's why the baby died. It was an affront. We need to find those IVF medications and get them out of this house before they poison Mark's spirit any further." The gasp that went through the room was physical, a collective intake of breath that felt like it sucked all the oxygen out of the hall. People who had sent me those spirit of anger texts looked at the screen in horror. They watched as the video showed Eleanor tearing the ultrasound photo of my dead child and tossing it into a trash bag. Mark was standing now. He wasn't looking at the screen anymore. He was looking at his mother. I had never seen that expression on his face. It was the look of a man watching his entire reality dissolve into ash. "Mom," he choked out. "It's a lie," Eleanor shrieked. She looked around the room, her eyes wild. "She's a nurse. She's used those AI things to fake this. It's a demonic attack." "Is this a demonic attack, Eleanor?" I asked, clicking the remote. The screen changed again. This time, it was the faithfulness section. A series of high-definition photographs filled the screen. Eleanor and Deacon Miller. The first was them at the spiritual retreat, sitting on a balcony in their bathrobes, laughing as they shared a bottle of wine. The second was them entering a Hilton hotel 3 towns over, their arms linked. The third was a screenshot of a text message from Eleanor to the deacon. "Arthur, I've got another $4,000 from the Heart Fund GoFundMe. Meet me at the usual spot? Martha won't suspect a thing if you tell her it's a regional board meeting." The silence in the room was now replaced by a low, rising roar of murmurs. Martha Miller, the deacon's wife, stood up. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just looked at her husband, who was frozen at the table,
his face a mottled purple, his massive frame making the deacon look like a panicked child. The finale was a recording. It was the audio Elias had captured from the car. People are so gullible, Arthur. They see a widow in a Sunday hat and they just want to give. I'll have Mark out of that marriage by the anniversary party. He's always been a mama's boy. He'll do what I tell him once I convince him she's crazy. The screen went black. The title card returned. A Lifetime of Faithfulness. I turned the microphone off and stepped down from the stage. The room was absolute chaos. People were standing, shouting, pointing. The flying monkeys, who had been Eleanor's fiercest defenders, were now the loudest voices in the room, screaming about betrayal and sacrilege.
They weren't angry because she was a monster. They were angry because she had made them look like fools. Eleanor did exactly what I knew she would do. She collapsed. She fell to the floor, clutching her chest, gasping for air. "My heart," she wailed. "My heart! Someone, call an ambulance. I'm having a heart attack. Clara, save me!" The crowd parted. They all looked at me. I was the nurse. I was the one who was supposed to rush to her side and perform the miracle. I walked over to her slowly. I didn't run. I didn't panic. I knelt down beside her, not out of care, but to check her vitals. I put 2 fingers to her carotid artery. Her pulse was strong, steady, and fast. The pulse of someone who was terrified of being caught, not someone who was dying. I checked her pupils. They were reactive. I looked at her skin. She wasn't pale. She was flushed with rage. "You're fine, Eleanor," I said, loud enough for the people in the front row to hear. "Your heart is as strong as it's ever been. You're just having a panic attack because the money just stopped flowing." "I'm dying," she hissed at me, her eyes snapping open, full of venom. "You've killed me. I'll sue you for everything you have." "You don't have a lawyer, Eleanor," I whispered in her ear, "and after the church sees the forensic audit I'm handing to the elders tonight, you won't have a house either." I stood up and looked at Mark. He was standing 5 feet away, his hands shaking. Is she okay?" he asked. "She's perfectly healthy, Mark," I said. "She's been healthy the whole time we've been paying for her treatments. She's just a very good actress." Mark looked down at his mother, who was still rolling on the floor, performing for an audience that was already leaving. He looked at the screen, then back at me. "I didn't know," he whispered. "Clara, I swear I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said, "but you chose not to see, and now I'm choosing for myself." I walked out of the banquet hall. I didn't wait for the ambulance that someone eventually called. I didn't wait for the deacon to try and explain himself to the elders. I didn't wait for Sarah to try and justify why she had a condo in the city paid for by my overtime hours. I walked out into the cool night air and I took a deep, clean breath. For the first time in 6 years, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of a family on my back. I felt light. I felt empty in a way that was finally blissfully quiet. The fallout was only just beginning, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. The aftermath of the Faithfulness Gala was not a quick explosion. It was a slow, agonizing burn that scorched every corner of Eleanor's carefully constructed world. When the paramedics arrived at the banquet hall, they found a woman who was perfectly capable of screaming, but chose to perform a silent, clutching at the chest pantomime for the benefit of the remaining elders. I watched from the doorway as they loaded her into the ambulance. One of the EMTs, a guy I'd worked with during several trauma shifts, caught my eye. He gave me a look of confusion, then a subtle shake of his head after checking her vitals. He knew. I knew, and within an hour, the ER attending physician, a man who had no patience for medical theater, confirmed it. "There is absolutely nothing wrong with her heart," the report read. "Patient exhibited symptoms consistent with a high-stress emotional reaction. Discharge recommended immediately." But Eleanor didn't want to be discharged. She wanted a sanctuary. She stayed in that hospital bed for 3 days, refusing to leave, claiming she was too weak to walk. She tried to turn the hospital staff against me, telling the nurses that I had poisoned her and orchestrated a coup to steal her home. She didn't realize that in a hospital, nurses talk. My colleagues knew me. They knew my work ethic, my patience, and my history. They looked at her with the professional coldness reserved for malingerers, patients who fake anus for secondary gain. While she was busy playing the victim in room 412, I was busy with the paper trail. I spent the first 72 hours in a state of clinical efficiency. I met with a forensic accountant recommended by Elias. We sat in a room filled with the scent of stale coffee and ink, going through 5 years of bank records, credit card statements, and the digital crumbs Eleanor had left behind. It was worse than I thought. Eleanor hadn't just been taking our $1,800 a month, she had been double dipping. She had convinced Mark that the house insurance was separate, so he was paying an additional $200 a month for premium coverage that didn't exist. She had been using the emergency credit card for everything from high-end skincare to tithes back to the church, meaning I was essentially paying her church donations so she could look like the most generous member of the congregation. The most damning discovery, however, involved Sarah. The $153,000 we had given Eleanor hadn't just sat in a bank. Eleanor had used $80,000 of it as a down payment on a luxury condo in the city for Sarah, framing it as an investment for the family's future. The title was in Sarah's name, but the mortgage payments were being funneled through Eleanor's account using our money.
I didn't call a lawyer first. I called the district attorney's office. Because Eleanor had used GoFundMe to raise money for a non-existent heart condition, she had committed wire fraud.
Because she had stolen nearly $6,000 worth of specialty IVF medications from my home, medications I had receipts for, she had committed felony theft. And because she and Deacon Miller had been skimming from the church's roof and relief fund, they were looking at embezzlement charges. The church board was the first to strike. Once they saw the documentation Elias provided, the hotel receipts matching the dates the deacon claimed to be at leadership seminars, they didn't hesitate. They were terrified of a lawsuit from the congregation. They stripped Deacon Miller of his title, banned him from the property, and launched a full internal audit. His wife Martha filed for divorce the following Monday. She didn't just want a split, she wanted blood. She sued him for the entirety of his retirement fund, citing his moral turpitude and the dissipation of marital assets on his mistress. Then it was my turn. I filed for divorce from Mark. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but also the most necessary. He came to the apartment a week after the party, looking like a ghost of the man I'd married. He tried to apologize. He tried to tell me that he was sorting things out and that he had confronted his mother. "What did she say, Mark?" I asked, sitting across from him at the table where we used to plan our future. She says she did it for us," he whispered, his voice cracking. "She said she was holding the money in Sarah's condo so that when we had the baby, we'd have a city retreat. She said she didn't tell us because she wanted it to be a surprise." A surprise? I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up. She stole our house fund, mocked our infertility, and tore up our child's only photo to surprise us? Mark, she's a sociopath, and you're still trying to find the logic in her lies. "She's my mother, Clara. What do you want me to do? Throw her on the street?" "No," I said, sliding the divorce papers across the table. "I want you to be with her. Since you love her more than you loved our family, you can go live in that house I paid for, but you're gonna have to pay me back every single cent." I sued them both. I filed a civil suit against Eleanor for unjust enrichment and fraudulent misrepresentation. I filed against Sarah to claw back the equity in the condo that had been purchased with my stolen wages. The legal proceedings were a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. During the first deposition, Eleanor showed up in a wheelchair she didn't need, wearing an oversized wooden cross and a veil, as if she were mourning her own innocence. "I am a woman of God," she shrieked when my lawyer presented the hotel photos. "These photos are doctored. This is a digital lynching. Clara is a Jezebel who couldn't provide my son with an heir, so she's trying to strip me of my dignity." My lawyer, a shark of a woman named Lina, didn't blink. "Mrs. Miller, we have the IP address from the computer that created the fake Mercy Springs invoices. It matches your home router. We also have the testimony from the dog groomer, who admitted you paid her $500 to use her P.O. box address. Would you like to revise your statement?" Eleanor turned to Mark, who was sitting in the corner of the room. "Mark, tell them how I've suffered." Mark didn't look up. He was staring at a copy of the GoFundMe page, the one where she had used my miscarriage to buy a $2,000 designer handbag the very next day. The silence in that room was the final nail in her coffin. The justice was total. The DA offered Eleanor a plea deal to avoid jail time, given her age and lack of prior record, but it came at a massive cost. She had to pay full restitution to the church and to the victims of her GoFundMe scam. To do that, she had to sell the house, the sacred family home she had used to manipulate Mark for a decade. Every cent of the equity went into a trust to pay back the people she had defrauded. As for the $153,000 she owed me, the court granted me a judgment that allowed me to force the sale of Sarah's condo. Sarah, the golden child who had never worked a day in her life, was evicted 3 months later. She moved into a studio apartment above a laundromat and took a job at a fast food chain. She sent me a 10-page letter blaming me for destroying her artistic potential, which I promptly shredded and used as bedding for my new hamster. Mark tried to stay with his mother in a small rented apartment, but the dynamic had shifted. Without my income to fund their lifestyle, they were forced to live on Eleanor's meager actual pension. Eleanor's heart condition miraculously disappeared when there was no one left to pay for the treatments, replaced by a bitter, constant stream of vitriol directed at the son who allowed his wife to ruin them. Mark lasted 6 months before he checked himself into an intensive therapy retreat for victims of narcissistic abuse. He's still there, trying to figure out where his mother ends and he begins. I wish him luck, but I don't answer his calls. My life, however, has undergone a radical transformation. I took the money from the settlement, nearly $110,000 after legal fees, and I didn't buy a house. Not yet. I invested it. I went back to school and got my nurse practitioner license, specializing in women's health and fertility trauma. I wanted to be the person I needed when I was sitting in that ER room. I moved to a beautiful apartment in a different city, one with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the sun. There are no lilies here, no Eleanor blue, just a lot of plants, a very comfortable sofa, and a profound sense of safety. I spent a year in therapy. My therapist, Dr. Eris, helped me realize that I wasn't a victim of Eleanor's piety. I was a target for her predatory nature because of my own empathy.
We worked through the grief of a miscarriage not as a punishment or a shameful secret, but as a loss that deserved to be honored. I finally took that torn ultrasound photo, the one I'd managed to recover from the evidence pile, and I had a professional restorer fix it. It sits on my mantle now, framed in gold. It's not a source of pain anymore. It's a reminder of my strength. 6 months ago, I was promoted to clinical director of a major women's health center. My salary has doubled, but more importantly, my stress has vanished. I don't work double shifts to pay for someone else's pearls. I work because I love what I do. Last week, I received a final flying monkey message. It was a photo from a local news site back in my hometown. The headline read, "Former church pillar sentenced to community service for charitable fraud." The photo showed Eleanor. She wasn't in a Sunday suit. She was wearing a bright orange vest, picking up trash on the side of the highway. She looked old. She looked small. She looked like exactly what she had always been, a common thief who used a Bible to hide her hands. Beside her was Deacon Miller, who was also in an orange vest, looking equally miserable. Apparently, the Lord's work now involved clearing brush from the I-95 underpass. I looked at the photo for a long time, then I closed the tab. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel the need to gloat. I just felt finished. The story Eleanor tried to write for me, the story of the broken, bitter nurse and the saintly, suffering mother, was gone. I had reclaimed the narrative. I had used the paper trail to build a bridge to a life I never thought I was allowed to have. I walked over to my window and looked out at the city. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over everything. I picked up my phone and called a friend to confirm our dinner plans. We were going to a place that served the most expensive, most unpious steaks in town. As I grabbed my keys, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. My eyes were bright. My posture was straight. I didn't look haggard. I didn't look like someone who was carrying a cross. I looked like a woman who had finally learned that the only person responsible for my faithfulness was me, and I had been very, very faithful to myself. I am no longer the help. I am the hero of my own life. And Eleanor, she's just a woman in an orange vest, finally learning the value of a hard day's work.